Hello, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joining the webinar. Um, I apologize for my voice. My voice is completely gone. But welcome to another monthly World Urban Parks webinar. Before we begin, I want to introduce myself. I'm Alice Landon, Research Advisor for World Urban Parks. And on behalf of the entire World Urban Parks team, we want to thank you all for joining us today. As always, we love for our webinar participants to say hello. So while we wait for people to start pouring in, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, write us from which organization, from which park you're joining us, and from which city and which country. This will also help our presenters have some idea of where our experiences are, and so that we can create this common knowledge throughout the webinar. And before we start the webinar, I want to share some important announcements with all of you. First and foremost, I want to remind you that this year's Global Parks Congress is being held as a joint event with Parks and Leisure Australia, and it's supported by Green Adelaide. And it will take place in Adelaide, Australia from October 22nd to October 25th, 2023. So that's in just 3 months from today, 3 months and 3 days. The Congress theme is Sustainable Places, Spaces, People, and Habitat. And the full program is already out, so you can go check it out online. Registration is also open to the public. I would invite all of you to get your tickets so that we can see you in Adelaide. I will link that in the chat as soon as I'm done speaking. I also want to take the time to invite you all to listen to Pod Parks, where every Wednesday we have episodes that are supported by park experts from around the world. We just released our first episode of season 2, featuring Jonathan Cha, Julie Brissy, and Federico Cartin. We are so excited to be back. And today's episode goes hand in hand with today's webinar, so do feel free to check that out on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts right after this webinar. And last but definitely not least, I want to invite you all to participate in Parkitecture, an international design contest which seeks to celebrate innovation and creativity. Parkitecture is hosted by World Urban Parks. The first place winners in the professional categories will win $25,000. And we also have a student category with prizes up to $1,000. I will also be linking more information about that in our chat box, so feel free to sign up for that. And before we start the webinar, I want to remind all of you that all of the contents and all of the recording that you will hear today will be found in the World Urban Parks online community. If you're already a member, you'll have access to all of this material. And if not, you can join at worldurbanparks.org. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, I recommend that you leave them in the Q&A box in Zoom, so that at the end our speakers can have a Q&A space and you don't forget your question mid-conversation. And with that being said, I would like to introduce today's speakers, Gavin White, Kevin Halpenny, and Germán Enriquez. Gavin is an executive officer for World Urban Parks, the Climate Change and Resilience Committee. This webinar today is being hosted by the Climate Change and Resilience Committee. At home in Pittsburgh, he is the Director of Planning and Projects for River Life, a nonprofit dedicated to improving the city's riverfronts. Kevin Halpenny is Senior Park Superintendent with Fingal County Council in Dublin, Ireland, with responsibility for providing strategic direction and introducing policy initiatives relating to parks, green infrastructure, and climate change adaptation. And he is also the president of the Irish Landscape Institute and chair of the World Urban Parks Europe Committee. And Germán Enriquez is a certified parks professional with focus on the fields of sustainable development and environmental management, with a solid background in environmental and industrial engineering, quality control, and project management. And he is currently the director of San Pedro Parques, Mexico's first official Metropolitan Parks Department. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Germán, for joining us. And with that, I will leave the session to the three of you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Alice, and special thanks to everybody joining us today, especially folks from across the Atlantic, including our chair of the committee, Kevin, who's staying up real late for this webinar. It's my role just to introduce the committee and some of the work that we're doing. So I'll be really quick with that, and then I'll hand it over to our two expert committee members here to talk about some specific park examples. But just to get things kicked off here, we really believe strongly that, you know, urban parks in particular, they may not be the sort of Amazon forests of the world, but they're really critical places for climate change adaptation, for mitigation, and for education. So with that, let me just briefly throw up the mission and vision of World Urban Parks here. Luis, my apologies if these have been updated since I made this slide deck, but really this is a group of people who are across the world working to make better urban parks and better urban experiences through park development, park management, park programming, and it's a real delight to work with all of them. So if you're not already thoroughly engaged, please get to know more. Here is a listing of our committee. Apologies to Thomas, whose picture I am still missing, but we've got a really great group of people, again, representing diverse geographies here, who have engaged both professionally and personally in this conversation around climate change and resilience, and the role that urban parks can play in the solution. So like all World Urban Parks committees, we developed our sort of initial position statement, and I wanted to just sort of share that overview with you. And I've already sort of mentioned it, but again, we think parks are critical infrastructure for urban resilience, and that they are critical in these three senses that I started laying out, which is to say that, and perhaps more than any other park space, they are really valuable for educating people about this issue. They may not be the biggest, but they have the most impact in terms of people using these spaces, in terms of visitors, and we really think we can highlight the value of green space, of biodiversity, of all of these issues in our urban parks. But they do the real work of mitigating climate change problems, including carbon sequestration, which we'll talk about here today. And they also help cities adapt to the changing climate and the realities and the challenges that come with that. We laid out, and this should come as no surprise, that climate change is an issue, but climate justice and social equity are keys to solving that problem. So we can't simply invest in resilient infrastructure in wealthy neighborhoods and wealthy cities. We need to be thoughtful about how we deploy resources across the world and really help those who have been impacted most and frankly have contributed least to the problem. We also are working and have continued and will continue to explore and share best practices, guidelines, assessments of impact, all of which you're going to hear a little bit about today. So one of the things you can do in terms of engaging with our committee is we've got this climate change charter, and we can share these details with attendees after the presentation today. If you want to sign up, we think, you know, this is a quick and easy step to show your commitment. And then beyond that, we've also started collecting examples, as we mentioned, of best practices, of exciting projects around the world that are really at the forefront of tackling these issues. And so if you know of projects that you think are exciting, or if you've built one yourself or developed a program that you think in any way contributes to these efforts of mitigation, adaptation, or education, please share them with us, and I'll share my email in the chat once I've done speaking here in a moment. So we've started putting together just little fact sheets about each of these projects, and you can see, you know, these projects, they have multiple impacts, both in terms of mitigation, but also adaptation and education around climate change. So again, a bit of what this project in particular is doing, but we're seeking to do that for projects around the world and to continue to share the good work that you and others are doing in this effort. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin, who's going to talk about some specific work they're doing in Ireland around these issues. So Kevin, take it away.
Thank you, Gavin. I'll try and share my screen. Just bear with me. Share sound, yeah. So hopefully you're the full screen up. Now, which version are you using? You seeing the full screen now?
No, I
Not
think you
yet.
need the presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it might be loading.
My fault for adding too much material.
Kevin, you should be able to click the little icon at the bottom right that looks like a sign of some sort.
Right. I'm not seeing. I'm seeing my full screen now. Not coming up now.
Well, it's up there, but it's just not full screen.
Oh, okay. Let's try a different tack. I just stop that again and let's see.
Oh, that worked.
How's that?
Looks
That's
great.
perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Alicia. Delighted to be here today to participate in the July seminar, webinar of Urban Parks on the subject of carbon impacts of urban parks, and to ask the question or to discuss the question, can constructed wetlands in parks and open spaces contribute to carbon sequestration? And I hope you find this interesting. So let's see if I can move this now. So around the world, 70% of wetlands around the world have been lost since 1900. And there's growing scientific interest in using artificial or constructed wetlands as a way to mitigate the impact of global climate change, with most attention to date focusing on the use of their use for water management. And artificial urban wetlands may, however, contribute towards net zero targets due to their ability to sequester carbon. And my presentation today is in the context of the UN Sustainable Goals, and specifically goal number 13, the urgent action required to combat climate change and its impacts. So, as mentioned in the introduction, I'm the Senior Parks and Landscape Officer for Fingal County Council in Dublin, in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, and located just north of the city of Dublin, in the municipality there. And I'm involved with the planning and development of the parks and green infrastructure. And we've just had figures issued to us that the annual rainfall where I work in North Dublin is 7% up over the past 10 years, 683 millimeters. Sunshine levels are also up, but we know from studies that we've had the wettest 10 years in 300 years, pretty much since records began. And we know that that's attributable to human-driven climate change from the research that's being done. So I just want to look at, before we go on to the sort of artificial side of things, the importance of natural wetlands, such as peatland bogs, in mitigating the impact of heavy rainfall cannot be overstated. And these natural systems also have a very significant role to play when it comes to carbon sequestration. What we now know from evidence is that the undisturbed peatlands we have in Ireland, they accumulate carbon from the air at a rate of up to 0.7 tons per hectare per year. And that's equivalent to 2.6 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And CO2 footprints for Irish people is very high internationally. It's at 12 tons per annum. So you can see the amount of area, even in natural wetlands, that it can take to mitigate the level of carbon footprint from the population. And by protecting and restoring our peatlands, we are protecting our climate and preventing its fall and decline or degradation. So 1/6 of the island of Ireland, or 1.2 million hectares, is peatland bog. And Ireland ended commercial peat harvesting in 2020, and we've launched this peatland restoration plan. And that's designed to protect the millions of tons of carbon already stored in our bogs, and to help sequester more carbon as restored naturally functioning peatland ecosystems develop. And many of these restored bogs make fine outdoor amenities also, and are also being adapted for green energy purposes such as large wind farms. But so we know the importance of natural wetlands, but constructed wetlands also provide benefits. I'm going to talk now about constructed wetlands in the context of the management of surface water drainage. And we'll begin looking at traditional approaches to surface water drainage. And until relatively recently, we had a heavily engineered approach to surface water drainage. And immediately following a rainfall event, 95% of surface water would be sent to the nearest watercourse. And this is the opposite of what happens in nature, in greenfield sites, where 95% is naturally retained and 5% in the immediate aftermath of a rain event, and only 5% goes straight to watercourses. So the end result of that approach has been flooding of downstream developments, pollution of watercourses, destruction of watercourses, and major impact on ecology and biodiversity. So over the past 3 decades or so, we've seen a major move towards sustainable urban drainage systems, which takes a more holistic approach to the management of surface water. And this is known as the treatment train approach, where each stage of drainage is addressed with suitable measures, which can help reduce the impact of runoff. This is of particular importance in the context of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and climate resilient design. So we can see we need source control, site control, and regional control. I'll talk a little about that now. So under this system, we have source control, which is in the immediate vicinity of the part of development which is generating the runoff. Site control, which relates to the overall development site, usually involving open space and parkland, at least in the Irish context, related to the development. And then we have regional control, which relates to the wider network of drainage infrastructure beyond the boundaries of the site. And providing capacity at each stage in the treatment train helps relieve the negative impact of surface water. And features of site control and regional control offer most potential for constructed wetlands with related environmental benefits. As in these areas, we can increasingly focus our improvements to drainage in where I work in Fingal. So in Europe, the development of sustainable urban drainage systems has been informed largely by the goals and requirements of the European Water Framework Directive. And the widely accepted benefits of sustainable urban drainage, including constructed wetlands, are related to 4 main areas: water quantity, that is managing rain runoff; water quality, preventing pollutants entering watercourses; biodiversity enhancement or restoration; and then water-related amenity, which is of particular interest to us in relation to our parks and open space provision. So to date, the potential benefits of carbon sequestration have not been a significant consideration. And this is perhaps due to the difficulty in measuring the levels of sequestration possible as we continue to expand the amount of constructed wetland we are developing. It is worth considering the potential additional benefits relating to carbon sequestration, which may be available. So there are lots of types of sustainable urban drainage systems that you will be aware of, ranging from very modest linear swales along roads and even green car parks we use as part of our network of sustainable urban drainage. Even dropped curbs that take the water away from hard-standing areas rapidly into small areas for attenuation. And then larger linear sort of canal type features, permeable paving, sort of very modest localized depressions. Even here we have a sports pitch, which is developed as a sustainable urban drainage unit, with all of the area underneath the pitch being occupied by attenuation, constructed attenuation area. And then more recently, we're moving towards larger, more strategically located areas of wetland, and these offer the most potential in terms of carbon sequestration. So where might this real potential and carbon sequestration calculation be worth consideration? I've included some case studies which may illustrate the potential opportunities for using constructed wetlands for carbon sequestration. And this slide illustrates an 80-hectare park we are developing along a river corridor, which is a number of surface water outfalls, like this one up here. And we are currently working on design for constructed wetlands to replace these outfalls. And these designs are largely based around the 4 principles of water quantity, water quality, biodiversity enhancement, and parkland amenity improvement. And the potential for carbon sequestration may be another factor for consideration. You can just see the configuration here. There's a number of these outfalls along the river valley. They feed into this river, and ultimately that ends up here in our very nice estuary, which is really important area for overwintering birds. It's a very important amenity. So protecting that, protecting it from levels of rainfall at very extreme levels of rainfall, but also in terms of its environmental integrity and the biodiversity in particular, is a real it's of real importance to us, and we're doing a lot of work in the context of developing this park to ensure that protection happens. So likewise, in new developments such as this, where we've a dedicated 1.5 hectare attenuation pond that's been recently developed, the potential for carbon capture is not currently a consideration, but it may well be into the future because there is potential there. That's the recently constructed wetland that serves the needs of that 1,000 property development, and that is sort of the new approach as compared to the previous case study, and that's attenuated very well before the water enters the river, another river actually, which ends up also in the estuary I showed you. So planning for constructed wetlands, such as this nature reserve we are developing, may yield very significant benefits relating to carbon capture. And this is a photograph taken a couple of years ago. And just this is a slide of it just today, and it illustrates well how quickly wetlands can mature and develop and become functioning elements in terms of water management. And in particular, you know, they're so dominated by herbaceous material that they very rapidly become features which can contribute to carbon sequestration. Just some more images of the same feature. So carbon sequestration is a highly complex and dynamic process. And with the level of research undertaken to date, it's quite difficult to be definitive or reliably predict the levels of carbon sequestration which can be expected for a given area of constructed wetland. However, an increasing body of evidence points to the potential of constructed wetlands to contribute positively to carbon sequestration, albeit that there appears to be a degree of variability relating to site-specific factors such as soil type, climate, and the species of vegetation involved. And you can see here very clearly there's a whole lot going on. There's sort of releases, and that, you know, there's sequestration, but there's you know, the various other gases involved, like methane and nitrous dioxide. So getting the net situation has been quite complex for people looking into this issue. But notwithstanding that, I've looked at some of the data, and from one study we see reported carbon sequestration levels of between 617 and 977 grams of carbon per meter square per year. This is a study going back to 2013, and that nets out at 2.4 kilos per square meter of carbon dioxide per annum. That's showing us that that's a possibility. And if you look at what I referred to earlier, the current average carbon footprint in Ireland, which is 12 tons of carbon dioxide, that equates to an area that would be required to offset carbon for one person of 5,000 square meters. So it's a big ask in terms of you know, carbon sequestration by constructed wetlands. So just going to give you some conclusions. It's important and really important that we conserve and enhance natural wetlands to ensure the ongoing capacity of those wetlands to sequester carbon. We need to prioritize the use of constructed wetlands and an appropriate approach to sustainable urban drainage. We need to plan for the provision of constructed wetlands at a large scale, a large strategic scale in the context of sustainable development. We need to retrofit constructed wetlands to improve water quality management and achieve climate objectives, including carbon sequestration. As individual carbon footprints reduce, and they are reducing, the relative impact of constructed wetlands will increase. But more research, and specifically relating to carbon sequestration in constructed wetlands and open spaces and parks, is vital. Just included this slide because this is past, you know, very heavy rain events causing mayhem and localized flooding. This is the future that we know. The constructed wetlands. This wetland actually has been opened now, you know, upstream from the town that I'm showing on the left, and that's the future, to have that capacity built in, and integrated constructed wetlands in our parks and open spaces are a vital element in that equation. So thank you for your attention, and I'll pass you over now to Herman.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and I think I'll try to live up to the expectation of what's next. But anyway, I think we can definitely conclude that carbon is best when we see it on the ground, because when we see it on the atmosphere, that's when we have some problems. And with that, let me share my screen just to talk a little bit about it. Okay. All right, there we go. So yeah, in terms of climate change, I'll go really quick, just reintroducing myself again. My name is Germán Enriquez. I work in San Pedro Parques, and it's part of a metropolitan area of Monterrey in the north of Mexico. And I'm part of the World Urban Parks Board. And yeah, together with Gavin, Kevin, and many others, we've been trying to, collect all this knowledge about how parks impact climate change. And anyway, what I'm going to present is not only one of the projects that I've been working on, but also the project from another of the members of the committee in New Zealand, because I actually saw that there's a lot of people from New Zealand in the audience. So you'll be familiar with what we will present a little bit forward. Okay, so in terms of climate change, I mean, I think that most of the audience is already educated about it, but anyway, just continuing what Kevin was saying, carbon looks best in the ground, because otherwise, I mean, what we see in terms of the greenhouse gases that we have in the earth, when there is an excess of carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, is pretty much what we get all these greenhouse, global warming and many other effects that we have seen lately with these record-breaking years of the hottest summers and all these meteorological events going more into the extreme. So anyway, just making an emphasis of how important it is to know that carbon in the atmosphere is good for life, but if there is an excess of it, then it causes a problem for the way that we humans are used to live on the earth. So anyway, these are the main sources of carbon that we're emitting to the atmosphere. And now, just some of the effects of having too much carbon in the atmosphere and how that relates to specifically impacting a lot of the most vulnerable population on Earth. No matter where you are, it's always an effect that we're not prepared for. And anyway, this is a global effort in order to keep things in balance. So the big question is, how can urban parks impact climate change? And the topic of today is, of course, carbon sequestration. So this is what I'm going to present a little bit. But first of all, when we speak about this, we need to know that everything is related. I mean, carbon sequestration is just one of the many things that we need to improve in order to keep things in balance. But it's not just there. I mean, in order to bring balance, we also need to check how much we are emitting in terms of carbon, and that's another different conversation that we're trying to put into the table. So anyway, when we're speaking about how urban parks impact climate change, we're speaking about three things that what this committee is working on: adaptation, mitigation, and education. That's the main roles of urban parks in climate change. When we go about how urban parks help adapt in order to make cities a little bit more resilient. Sorry, my dog is having a little bit of yeah, he's also really concerned about climate change, so he's crying right now. But anyway, it's because my girlfriend is not here. Anyway, sorry. So we need to take a lot of focus on how we design parks, or how parks are designed, because parks can help pretty much put a lot of exponentiate and potentialize all the benefits that a city well planned can do, in terms of like Kevin was just presenting, how a city can be designed in order to sequester carbon, to keep the carbon that is on the ground, and also in natural cycles that make it more sustainable. Because when it doesn't, cities in the last two and 3 centuries have been designed in order to make nature not being the protagonist of it. And what happens, what we're seeing on the screen, is, for example, cities that they are on sea level, or that they are not really well designed in terms of water management, stormwater management, they tend to flood, and they tend to cause a lot of not only environmental but also economical damages. So Copenhagen is one of the best cities in terms of design for adaptation for climate change. They have a lot of stormwater, so the way they design parks is for them to be not only spaces where carbon can be sequestered, but also how to manage stormwater in order to transform the environment into a city with rain and a city without rain. So, for example, one of the best examples is in Enghave Park in Copenhagen. That what you see is, for example, this beautiful park in winter. That's why there is not a lot of leafage. But at the same time, when there is a storm, it looks like this, and it's a beautiful lake. And this is something that has been taken into account into a lot of design. So, for example, this is also a court for many different sports, but it's also a pond. And this is something that is all around Copenhagen. And this is a great example of how cities can be resilient in terms of stormwater, but at the same time help sequester carbon through all the natural landscapes. Another great example of what happens if you have too much carbon in the atmosphere is León, one of the city that I come from. It used to flood a lot because it's just below the mountain range. So there was pretty much not a natural barrier for all the water that came from the mountain range. So there was a dam that was being built, but at the same time, this dam created all the characteristics in order to be more like more wetland than a gray infrastructure stuff. So what we have right now is the León Metropolitan Park. That is an excellent example of how much you can do for the environment in terms of helping mitigate, but also adapt the city for climate change effects. And I'm going to speak about this park in a bit. So I just want to introduce it, that it was designed as a matter of adaptation for extreme weather events, but right now it helps a lot in terms of carbon sequestration in the city. So now, getting to the topic, how can urban parks impact climate change in terms of mitigation, where is a lot of where carbon sequestration goes more for? So I'm going to speak from the point of view of operations. I mean, all of us that have the privilege of managing parks, we know that there is a lot of different choices that you can make from the design, from the operations, from different fields of our discipline that can impact all these results. So there is pretty much, in terms of emissions, when we are calling emissions and sequestration values, when it comes to mitigation, we have to separate these. So operational emissions can be measured. And this is really important in order to have the balance, because it doesn't matter how much you sequestrate. If you emit too much, then you break the balance, and it is all about balance. So in terms of operational emissions, I'm going to show you an example of a really practical tool of how to measure what are the emissions in terms of greenhouse gases that your park operation has. So pretty much when we speak about emissions from operations of a park, we can divide it into three main categories. The first one is how much electricity you use for your operations. The second one is the fuel. I mean, especially for all your machinery and vehicles. And number three is the trash or residues, because organic residues, we know that they produce not directly carbon dioxide, but they produce methane, which is 25 times more impactful in terms of greenhouse gas. So you can do this by measuring things that you already have. I mean, like how much electricity you need to pay for, how much fuel you consume, and also in terms of trash, there are really easy ways to do it. And from the other side, you can also complete this inventory by saying how much you sequester. So the tool for sequestering carbon in parks is pretty much two direct things and 1/3 that is indirect. But the first one is trees. That's one of the most straightforward. And the way to do it is through having a complete, or well, everybody can have their definitions. What is a complete inventory? But using data, especially, for example, tools like i3, which is open source, and it gives you a lot of data in terms of how the difference between a young tree and an adult tree, depending on the species, how much carbon you can sequestrate per year. So all the numbers that you see here, we're speaking about the Metropolitan Park of León, where we conducted this first exercise. So yeah, trees is one of the direct things. And the second one that has completely to do with what Kevin just presented is water bodies. I mean, some natural parks that they are more in wetlands and ponds, they have more capacity of doing so. But as Kevin presented, it's incredible that it's not that much compared to how much you emit in terms of carbon. I mean, it's really good to see this perspective because, for example, this park that you saw, it's a great lake. I mean, it's a dam, but it's around 250 hectares. It's a big lake. However, it only sequestrates approximately about 15 tons per of carbon per year. So anyway, and the third thing that you can do in terms of carbon is not direct sequestration, but it's like what you avoid emitting. So therefore, it's not sequestration, but just things that you avoid emitting by using clean energy. In this case, solar energy. I mean, the way you consume power in your parks. I mean, if you have solar panels, then you can also bring that to all these emissions that you are not releasing into the atmosphere, which counts as sort of sequestration, but it's not direct sequestration. So using this really simple formula, you can have this comparison. And for example, for Metropolitan Park of León, we saw that in a year, we are emitting around 195 tons of CO2, and we were sequestering, thanks to the great tree inventory, around 600 tons of CO2. So what is the final number for this? We concluded that it was around 400 tons of CO2 that this big 370 hectares park was sequestering each year. So what is that? I mean, when we put it into everyday lifestyle choices, well, it is only equivalent to taking out 85 vehicles off the road. And well, for all of us that love a good barbecue, it is equivalent of not doing 112,000 barbecues, which I mean, I guess that in the World Cup final there were more than that going at the same time in every city. So anyway, it's really good to put this in scope in order to see, okay, how much parks are really mitigating on that. But anyway, it's super useful to have this tool in order to know, because from all the things that happen in the city, the parks are one of the most important in terms of these kinds of mitigation. And it really puts a lot of pressure on all the public policies based on reducing emissions, which is way important. So anyway, I'm just leaving you here with this model that we use that could be applied for any park. Really, it's really simple. You can go into more depth depending on the resources you have, but this can be used worldwide and it's pretty much the same. And also, I'm just gonna end my participation by showing you the great work that the Auckland Council in New Zealand, they did about this research just this year. It's about when we were speaking about the emissions of a park by operating it, but there is another thing that is super relevant, is the embodied emissions. What is that? What is an embodied emissions? Is every single thing in the park that has been made, that is being built by different materials. I mean, speaking about artificial turf or the roads or the equipment, everything has some emissions, not by being constructed. So all that, when there is a park that some construction takes place, there are some embodied emissions that are really important to take care into this inventory. So anyway, the magnificent research that they did in Auckland, it really takes a different perspective on how sustainable some choices when designing a parks are. So here they compare 3 different kinds of parks: typical sports park, a typical regional park, which the park I just mentioned could be more into this category. There are these big natural parks that they have a lot of nature, and the typical community park, which is the normal size or even like small size parks that we have most in our cities. So here, the impacts are really different in terms of how much carbon they can sequestrate and how much carbon they emit into that. So anyway, just going really quickly about it here, it really blew my mind away to see that a sports park, it actually has a lot of emissions. And if you take a look into what causes this park to have a lot of emissions compared to the carbon sequestration that we're seeing right here, it's pretty much embodied emissions. And if you take another zoom in for what is this, I mean, in this particular park that they were giving us an example in Auckland, is the artificial turf. And that makes a lot of sense. If you really see the artificial turf is made of a lot of plastic. So now, speaking from a life cycle assessment point of view, what happens if you change the material from all this petrol-based material to something more recyclable, more sustainable? Then the impacts of a park, of this park specifically, are being reduced a lot. So there are really cool insights in this report. I highly recommend that definitely everyone should be taken into account when deciding how to build new sports parks. So anyway, this is what I was telling you about. 95% of all these emissions, embodied emissions, come from the choices in artificial turf. Now, there is a lot of questions regarding, well, yeah, with natural turf, you have to use a lot of fertilizer, which is also not good. So anyway, it's an important balance, but it's really important to take that into account. Then for a regional park here, as we were mentioning in the example in Mexico, which is completely matches, yeah, regional parks, they do have a carbon negative result. In our cases, they sequester more carbon than they actually emit. However, there is another thing here. If you take into account all the traveling emissions that, for example, most of these regional parks are not inside cities, they are outside of cities. So all the emissions from the gas that you need in order to get there in a normal combustion vehicle, now that's another thing to take into account. So it's a lot of the scope. I mean, in this case, check this out. I mean, it doesn't matter how much carbon you sequester, but the emissions for the visitors that go into this park because of the ways that they travel into the park, it completely outweighs all the benefits from the sequestration of the regional parks. Super interesting, right? And now, finally, for the community parks, it has a mix, it's a balance. I mean, we know that community parks come in all sizes, shapes, and colors. So anyway, we can see here that they can be really different depending on how they are built. So anyway, all in all, we would like to say thank you, New Zealand, for this really enlightening research about the choices that how we construct parks. They really can completely I mean, if you make the bad decisions when constructing a park, it can completely shadow all the benefits in terms of carbon sequestration it can have. And that's a really heavy statement that we need to take into account as park professionals. So anyway, thank you very much. That's pretty much what I wanted to show you, and we are really open for questions. Thank you. So Gavin?
Well, I'm seeing some questions in the chat. So we have an attendee who asked or said, awesome presentation, Herman, good job. And did the emissions measure transport to and from the park as well? And right at the end there, you got into that. So I think we can move from there. Obviously, transport is a huge factor. They also, or somebody said, I love these graphics about embodied emissions. How do you think these numbers can be delivered to park professionals to make changes?
Well, yeah, I would like to answer that because I've been thinking a lot about it as well. And we need tools as park professionals in order to make good decisions. And these tools, when it comes to embodied emissions, it's pretty much life cycle assessments. We need a lot of that. Maybe most of us I mean, I'm unfamiliar with the term life cycle assessment, but maybe it is not so popular. But it's pretty much knowing how much having a well, knowing the impact that every material has in the environment regarding their life cycle. Because I mean, we know that everything in parks, vegetation, infrastructure has a time limit. So depending on that, it's pretty much all the impacts that they have. So anyways, really the numbers you need to balance and really compare different scenarios. I mean, is it better to have artificial turf? Well, what you're going to measure? I mean, if you're going to measure greenhouse gas emissions versus artificial turf, then definitely the artificial turf from plastic is, as we saw, is not good. But what about recycling materials for the artificial turf? And then it might outweigh in benefits from a natural turf. So we need these kind of numbers. I know that in Europe, there is a lot of research in life cycle assessment. We need to make that more available worldwide in order to make decisions.
Yeah, I think accessibility is a huge issue as well in terms of the sustainability considerations. I think, you know, that forward planning, active travel and sustainable transport is a big part of the future considerations around park development.
And I'll just make a plug and say these are the sort of things that we hope to share as a committee. And if you're interested in helping spread the good word, then by all means reach out. We'd love to talk. Kevin, this one's probably for you. Do you think recovering channels and dry rivers inside cities can help climate adaptation?
Yeah, I think that's a major. I think we've undergrounded a lot of our rivers in cities, and I think you know, that opening back up those channels has multiple benefits, including potential carbon sequestration, but also you know, whole biodiversity, and you know, looking at alternative models around transportation, which don't, you know, aren't car based and can use river corridors for sustainable transport. I think there's a huge potential there. We just need to change our perspective and way of looking at things. And I know there's a few examples, particularly in France, where very significant work has been done on that.
Right. And I think you've already mentioned a couple of times, how do we reduce the travel footprint of visitors, right? About active transportation. It's about utilizing these corridors and these wetlands and park projects for multiple benefits and multiple means to reduce that carbon impact. But one more for you, Kevin. What is the future of these man-made wetlands? How do we ensure their durability in city planning?
I think you need to use the phrase baked in from the outset. I think it's about policy planning and projects, and you know, that bringing that understanding of multifunctional green infrastructure, where, you know, a river corridor is also an active travel link. It's also a biodiversity feature. It's also enhancement of you know, that's a way of looking at you know, nature-based solutions in a composite collective way is the key here, so that you're not seeing, you know, single-use features, that they have that multiple application. And the man-made wetlands are really key for that. I've seen, you know, I see that where we have developed wetlands, there's a sort of a natural, they're like natural magnets for people, and people respond and resonate very strongly with people. I think we've maybe gone away from that in the urban context. We think they're sort of you know, drainage in and of itself is viewed as a sort of a functional thing, as opposed to an opportunity. I think we need to flip that around so that water, our response to water is much more positive and much more creative.
Right. And a related question just popped up. So we'll stick with you, Kevin, and then another question for Herman. And we'll go to one that I think is quite good to end on following that. So in Monterey, we are currently having a problem with the government because they're stripping the vegetation from the main river that crossed the river with the excuse that it will cause more flooding. How can we make a case against this?
Well, I suppose there's no. We by the way, we've had the issues of similar to that, because people automatically think that getting water away through clearing vegetation is a good thing. Now, I showed in one of my slides that you know, in a greenfield situation, 95% of water is held in you know, in a greenfield situation with that, you know, what just isn't developed in an urban way. So that's the information, that's the evidence. There's plenty of evidence around that, and all over the world people are trying to build back natural systems of retaining water, so we don't have flood problems, and that definitely doesn't involve removing vegetation, or you know, the general approach of removing vegetation is very damaging to flood management. So there are lots of examples now, and I would strongly recommend that you look at those examples and reference them in terms of people developing, you know, wet meadows, reopening wet meadows, reopening areas for that floods can expand into, as opposed to clearing vegetation.
Yeah, that's great. And whoever sent that message in, please do reach out. We'll make sure we can get you some of that evidence for sure. Because we're short on time, I'm going to just briefly mention this comment and / question, but because I think we've talked a bit about it. It really speaks to, you know, says presentations are very informative, but also specific to carbon sequestration. Have you considered the carbon reduction related to stormwater captured by trees and wetlands versus traditional resource heavy management? Open space and trees also cool and shade, further reducing energy related carbon use. And I think it's a really good point. I think Herman touched a little bit on those multiple impacts of parks and how they not only sequester the carbon directly, but you know, that cooling aspect is really essential, and you know, people will use less AC, less carbon emitted in the atmosphere. But Herman, to put the pressure on to end us, if the committee had to deliver one message to all park professionals around the world, what would it be?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, parks are one piece of the puzzle. That's really important. I mean, parks are not the only answer in terms of climate change, but they are definitely one of the main connectors between different efforts. I mean, what you just mentioned regarding, I mean, the impact of cooling down cities and how all that has a great effect in terms of energy use for heating or cooling. It's incredible, but it also has to do with building isolation. So anyway, it has there is not just one simple answer. Parks is not just one simple answer, but it's definitely one of the best platforms in order to connect with different other areas of research. And I think that's pretty much what we're looking for in this committee. And we're trying to put from different perspectives of park management, park research, and things that have to do with open space, and connect with other research that also makes the case of coming up with really well structured efforts, because we know what we need to do. We know that we need to lower the emissions in terms of greenhouse gases. We need to improve the adaptation and mitigation characteristics of cities, and we also need to spread the word about what is going on. So as World on Parks, we have to connect. We need to be a platform in order for all these different research to take place, to learn, to share, and coming up with better solutions for different parts of the world.
Excellent. I think we've got to end it there. We've taken a couple extra minutes of folks' time. Really appreciate your attendance here today. I'll pass it back to Alice for any final words.
Yeah, well, thank you. Sorry, thank you to the three of you for your time. The last two questions are currently being answered via text by Gavin, so thank you for that, Gavin. I want to thank all of you for your attendance as well. Remember that this webinar is a part of a monthly webinar series that World Urban Parks is hosting. So stay in touch through social media, where we'll be posting more information about the upcoming August webinar, which will also be a fantastic one. Don't forget to reach out to the committee via ccrc@worldurbanparks.org. We will make sure to add all of these links to the webinar recording as well. Remember that if you're already a member, you can access everything that was said today, and I will make sure to include all of the additional links as well in our member platform. It should be uploaded within a couple of days, and if you're not yet a member, this is our official invitation. So with that being said, have a great rest of your day, have a great night, and we will see you in the upcoming August webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.